Good evening. I'm Professor Elizabeth Prodromou, and I teach in the International Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I also am the faculty director of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. We were established 7 years ago, and the mission of the initiative is to broaden and deepen religious literacy in the study, practice, and leadership of international relations, law, and diplomacy across the full range of professional spaces, geographies, and practitioner areas of expertise. Now, part of the work of the initiative includes an annual conference, a guest lecture series, research on subjects as diverse as migration, religion and security, cultural heritage and religious sites, etc. But part of that work is the energy of the Fletcher Student Club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. And it's the Fletcher Student Club that convenes us all here this evening. I want to welcome our three speakers to the third in a four-part series on religion and peace building. We had our first event on February 18th, A Power Like No Others was our introductory panel. On the 4th of March, we did a panel on liberation theology and peace building. And this evening with our distinguished panel, we're going to be talking about women, religion, and peace building. And then finally on April 1st, we have our final panel on religion and community, growing resilience through peace building. I want to give a shout out and thank you to Juliana Rohrdoff and Shirin Shah, who are the leads for tonight's panel. They conceived of it and they organized it. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors from the Fletcher School, both the CGIA and also Fletcher Leads. And Fletcher Leads, which stands for Leadership, Equality, and Diversity, is a program that aims to enhance and refine Fletcher women and female competence, confidence, and leadership to fulfill potential in the world and to make a positive impact, build careers of significance, feel empowered as individuals, and balance their work endeavors and passions with their families and other responsibilities. So Fletcher League seeks to contribute to gender equality and inclusive diversity in both the classroom and throughout people's careers. And so thank you for their co-sponsorship of this panel today. It's a pleasure to welcome three distinguished speakers, two of whom are dear friends and one of whom I have every expectation will become a dear friend. The three panelists here tonight are going to talk to us about women, religion, and peace building, talking about how religion and conflict is different from religious conflict, and also think about the role of women in conflict prevention, conflict transformation, and peace building, and also help us excavate where women do their work in peace building at the interstices of religion and peace building, but also where they may be excluded and why and how to change that. So with no further ado, I'll say a little bit about our panelists. I encourage you to look at their long bios online. They're impressive in every way, but I'll give you a brief summary of each of our panelists. First is James Patton, who is the current CEO, Chief Executive Officer, and President of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And he has worked at the interstices of peacemaking and conflict transformation for I think his entire career since finishing at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So it's great to have a fellow Fletcher alum here with us. Welcome, James. Our second panelist is Dr. Aza Karam, and she is the Secretary General for Religions for Peace International. Dr. Karam is a well-known global figure in peace building and religion. She has a long background and career at the United Nations, where she's worked specifically at the intersection of religion, development, and diplomacy. And Aza, it's wonderful to welcome you in cyberspace to Fletcher. And then finally, Sonia Licht, who is president of the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. I could say Sonia is a legend, and I think she is in religion and peace building. That's not hyperbole. So it's wonderful to have you with us again at the Fletcher School. Sonia was part of the Yugoslav dissident movement from the late 60s, and from the mid 80s, she founded numerous local and international NGOs, and she spent her entire life's work in peace building through activism and civil society in the Balkans. And her experience spans interreligious peace building and peacemaking across faith traditions and within faith traditions and with religions and with NGOs that have nothing to do with religion. And I think that's a common thread for all three of our speakers and their experience here this evening. So I look forward to hearing you on the particularities and the specificities of religion, women, religion, and peace building. And I think I'll start to the top left of my screen. So that means we'll start with you, Sonia, and then we'll go to James and close with Azza. Thank you for being with us this evening. Sonia, you have to unmute yourself. Okay. And I encourage the listeners and viewers to populate the Q&A with questions, because we'll go to that afterwards. Sonia, you're on.
First of all, I want to thank you for your kind words. And you said something that I felt a little bit embarrassed, but doesn't matter. This is a great pleasure, really, to be back at Fletcher and in my beloved Boston, at least in this format. I remember 3.5 years ago when I was there and we had that wonderful seminar and a great get together, as James just said at the beginning when we met on the screen, that this is what we really lack in this virtual world, but better something than nothing. So I still feel very, very grateful that we can be together here tonight and with the great audience, I'm sure, who will also participate with us in this endeavor. Well, I would like to start with a short story. And the story is happening on 28th of September, 1991 in Sarajevo. I was part of and in fact, one of the organizers of a peace caravan that was initiated by the Helsinki Citizen Assembly, which I was then the co-chair of, and a great Italian organization, civic organization. The acronym was ARCI, and they were really a huge movement of people building peace, fighting for peace, encouraging peacemaking throughout the world. Had a very, very serious experience with the Middle East and bringing together different faiths, different ethnicities in that very troubled part of the world. And then, of course, they got also quite involved in the Balkans. So we started mid-September, a peace caravan in Trieste, traveled through already war-ravaged parts of the country in Croatia, and finally arrived to Sarajevo. We traveled through Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, had all kinds of meetings on that in that trip, and then finally we got to Sarajevo and had a meeting with, of course, different meetings with various people who were struggling to remain calm in an atmosphere which already had the smell of war in the air. I have to say that only 3 months before we were there, there was a huge, the largest peace concert organized in Sarajevo with more than 300,000 people from all over Yugoslavia in the streets. And of course, they could not really get into any space. There was a huge space, but it was too small to host them all. Organized by a television, which was called UTEL, the last media that was struggling to remain Yugoslav and trying to keep Yugoslavia together. I mean, this was of course a struggle that we all were very hopeful will succeed, but it was so clear in Sarajevo to me that it won't happen. Why? In June, 300,000 people. When we gathered in front of a beautiful Catholic cathedral, there were approximately 10,000. Those 10,000, however, it was a very sunny day. People were sitting in the cafes and watching us. The 10,000 that gathered there were, I must say, I would say the majority were women, but it was a very mixed group. And we created a link, a chain that was going around that cathedral, linking the cathedral, the Orthodox Church, the mosque, and the synagogue. So that chain basically was one of the most symbolic things we could do in that moment. And it was, I mean, it still brings back very beautiful and difficult memories. The day after that human chain and that demonstration of strength and positive energy, most of the people who were traveling with the caravan went to Dubrovnik to fly out from there, and this was when the first grenade fell on Dubrovnik. I was traveling back to Belgrade and then to the Labour Party Congress in Manchester. You can imagine the amount of fear I was living through, wondering whether anybody will maybe from the caravan be really facing a major threat. The caravan, before arriving to Sarajevo, was in Belgrade. The Italian women, who were especially active in the Archie movement, brought the first donation to a group of women in Belgrade who decided to form the Women in Black. The Women in Black, first time, in fact, were kind of initiated in Israel among Jewish and Palestinian women who were together in that movement. And the Italian women, in fact, were visiting them and then decided that this idea should be kind of spread throughout. So the first one to be initiated into this circle were the women from Serbia. The Women in Black exist until this very day. And it's all over the world. I remember very well, and I see Azra knows about them. Interesting to underline that the first group that in fact followed them after Belgrade was in New York. In solidarity, a group of women in Black were meeting every week, I think it was every Wednesday, in front of the UN building at the East River. So it is again one of those moments that basically proves that yes, in the peace, in trying to save the peace, to build peace, women are able to go across all dividing lines. But of course, this is just part of the story. And that kind of line of activism we experienced throughout the wars in the Balkans. There was another line, a parallel a parallel process where women were in fact used and misused by nationalist leaders because they knew very well that especially mothers can provoke emotions, can basically work for a different end than those women we were working with. These were the mother movements supported by Franjo Tuđman from Croatia, by Slobodan Milošević from Serbia, by Izetbegović from Bosnia. And these were really, so to say, a kind of effort to, in fact, transform the peace movement that was there, take over and use it for their own interests. The good news is this did not succeed. Yes, it was a huge eruption of interest throughout the world for these movements, but very soon it was understood that they became an instrument. An instrument exactly working to the other end of the story. So it, I would like for a moment to go back now to the women anti-war movement in my own country now. Serbia is one of the succeeding states after Yugoslavia fell apart. And to mention just two outstanding events. One was the candle lighting ceremony that was almost completely organized by women in Belgrade, where we used to get together every single evening between spring and fall 1992, when the war was already on in Bosnia as well. And through this candle lighting ceremony, the major message that we managed to send was that we are respecting the victims and that the victims can't be in any way named as belonging to a single group, to a single faith. The entire processes in the Balkans, because there were in fact a few conflicts happening one after the other, were by some called civil war, by the others ethnic war, by third religious war. It was a mixture of everything. But I must say, the fact is that those who were igniting these conflicts, they were not in the first place either religious leaders or nationalist leaders. These were people who in fact were following their partial interests through igniting and through leading these basically horrible conflicts that left hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of people refugees, and in fact destroyed a country by creating unstable or we can say today less stable than the other countries in the vicinity in Southeast Europe, countries which still have a lot of unsolved issues exactly because of the breakout up of Yugoslavia, and states that still did not, except Slovenia and Croatia, who became members of the European Union, still did not economically manage to be where they used to be before the war broke out. So the amount of suffering, the amount of still unsolved issues, such as, for example, Kosovo-Serbia conflict, which is not a conflict anymore, that part of the bloody conflict happened in 98, 99, ended up with the NATO intervention, bombing, again, many victims, many destroyed families. But the important thing is to underline that, in fact, all this also is the heritage of that major process of destroying a country. There were many efforts, for example, among women in Kosovo and Serbia during the last 20 and 20-something years. The most outstanding one was the Follow Us initiative started in 2012 among women politicians. For years, they managed, against all the odds, to meet, to be in a dialogue. Unfortunately, it didn't last. And the whole process, how it was taken over, is for a book or for a novel, and how, in fact, politicians and political leaders managed to absorb them into their own circles. And unfortunately, for the time being, that movement is also over. And the last thing I want to mention, where I see the light at the end of the tunnel, is the story of the Roma or gypsies or travelers, Roma who are facing a new emancipation model, or living and creating a new emancipation model in the Balkans. One of my great friends and a great Roma leader just came out with the idea that in this nationalist fever of the Balkans, Roma, in fact, understood that this is the moment when they can fight for their own identity, not a nationalist one, but an identity that is not only based on their social status, but on the status that they are the people who are, in fact, all the time on the margins of what's going on. They are now, with new generation of educated young Roma, and especially young Roma women, in fact, occupying finally the spaces they could not occupy for decades and centuries. So that is also a very interesting issue, very much to be studied, how this group that was always an outcast is managing to become self-conscious, and how they are able to take over at least a position that is close to what the others already are living and don't have to fight for anymore. And sorry if I was a little bit too long, but that's what I wanted to share.
No, thank you, Sonia, and thank you for starting also with the personal story, which connects it to larger social and also global solidarity among women. So I will turn now to Dr. Azakaram, and she'll continue.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a great privilege to listen to Sonia, and indeed to serve on the same panel with her is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much, Sonia, for what you've shared, and thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to this delightful crew. I wanted to say 3 points. The first has to do with the story of women in war and peace building more generally. And there's an old story from liberation movement times where women are called upon to be part of liberation movement struggles, or at least the liberation movement from one side, from some other version. There's another version to them in another side, of course, but women are called upon in times of conflict and war to join the effort. We saw this in the First and Second World Wars, and it continues throughout when men have to go fight, and apparently women have to then mobilize to serve the society in ways that men were serving before. And then men come back from the conflict and the post-conflict period. And the story is, well, thank you very much. You can all go home now because the men are back. And this, I think, is the story of the 1960s and to some extent early into the 1970s. Because of this narrative and the historical narrative, we often tend to see that women's roles are viewed from that particular drama of join, go back to the kitchen, so to speak. And so we have a lot of studies from that era which inform us from a rather myopic perspective that women are there doing their best, trying to then engage in different peace movements, etc. That's the best that they can sort of do. But the limits to their ability to be in public positions once they indeed have contributed to a national liberation effort of whatever type, that there is a very stunted, limited ability. And I think Sonia spoke somewhat to that, but there was a transition that took place in the 80s and 90s. And this is the one that I want us to reflect on a little bit, because I recall drafting an article in the early 90s on the issue of women in war and peace, and trying to position the women as combatants, women who took up arms and fought alongside men. And the incredible resistance to that narrative was quite noteworthy, including by very well-known feminists, international relations theorists, political scientists, because it was a counter narrative at that time to simply pinpoint that there were women who were fighting alongside men, who were combatants. That was a counter narrative, and it was countercultural, counterintuitive, because it doesn't go ahead with this narrative of women as the sort of the born nurturers and peace builders and do-gooders and never go do violence kind of thing. And I think, to be honest, women have always been fighting for the longest possible time historically, especially religious wars. Women have had, Joan of Arc, anyone? But there's always been women combatants, and religions have always been a very actually powerful source of enthusiasm in the drive for women to take up arms. But also secular ideologies have been very powerful mobilizers of women to take up arms as well. So the notion that women are exclusively peacemakers and peace builders is a warped notion, and is the exact opposite, the other side of the coin, of the patriarchal image of women who shouldn't be involved in anything decision-making, anything public authority. The other side of the coin is, well, they're always peacemakers in conflict. Both sides of the coin, quite frankly, are a bit bust. It's a really lousy coin. I don't recommend investing with it. We also, in that space, overlook some very critical lessons that we should be learning from women's varied roles in positions of war and peace building. And I think we overlook things like massive reams of studies about political Islam that came out in the 1990s and the 2000s and until today, which look at Islamist movements without assessing the role that women play in them. It's as if they're all men. And the truth is absolutely the furthest possible narrative. And you can't have a movement that's men only. Never happened in life before, by the way. It's not going to happen in Islamic context. Why should it? But it helped us in a sense. It made it easy to overlook the critical contributions that women have made to movements which are religiously inspired as well. And so we don't understand and we don't realize that women play a very powerful role in Hamas, in Hezbollah, that actually in the 1960s, it was thanks to the women members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were not arrested in mass numbers as the male members were. And it was because they were able to stay out, they were able to continue that movement through brutal repression, which took place in the 1960s under the nationalist regimes across the region, that it was actually thanks to the women members of the Muslim Brotherhood that movement sustained one of its most brutal episodes, and that a very similar thing is happening now, but nobody wants to talk about it. So interesting that when we think we study and we think we have knowledge, we actually are looking at things from a very myopic perspective, and the studies and the knowledge that we have is exceedingly limited indeed. Again, structured by an almost subconscious desire to see black and white, and women somehow have to belong in the white camp. The truth of the matter is that as a result of this, not only have we ignored the varied roles that women play in religiously inspired movements as well as secular inspired movements, but we've also harmed tremendous numbers of women who, when it was when wars of the conflict were over and they needed to be reintegrated into their respective societies, there was nothing targeting their needs as women. And in fact, they were often discriminated against far worse than the men who had gone off to fight, because they had done something they were definitely not supposed to do. So the entire series of programs that came out in the 80s and 90s designed for reintegration and remobilization of ex-combatants thoroughly overlooked women who had been ex-combatants. So we actually perpetuated multiple levels of discrimination. We did not only miss out on learning quite a lot about the how and the why of the mobilization of women in those spaces, and therefore what they needed to be engaged in the peace building, because we didn't even look into their psychosocial support, into their needs as human beings, combatants coming back and needing to be reintegrated into societies, and how they were particularly targeted as a result. So I want to just speak to that because I think it's something that we've been willfully blind about for too long. Then came an awareness of the fact that, yes, women do play a rather unpleasant role sometimes in conflict, as conflict would demand. We begin to hear about the suicide bombers of the Tamil Tigers of Elam in Sri Lanka. We begin to hear a little bit about the Sendero Luminoso women and the roles that they played. But it's as if it's petered knowledge, little drops of knowledge. And the truth of the matter is that we're not talking about a minor group of women. And it really shouldn't matter how many women it takes to be members, active members of a society, including active members of a conflict. That at the end of the day, we are talking about human beings with human rights, and whether they are combatants or whether they are civilians, there are aspects to their knowledge and to their wisdom that then become very important for the role that they have to continue to play in the public lives of their particular societies. And Sonia, I know that you've spoken to this issue extensively before. One of the things that I think we celebrated is Security Council Resolution 1325. Why? Not so much because of the resolution itself, which was kind of obvious. And yeah, you do need to acknowledge the role of women and integrate them onto the peacemaking table, not as an afterthought, not as a favor that you do women, but because their experiences as sometimes the ones who also get the brunt of a conflict in every single context, and their experiences as combatants, the myriad ways in which women's lives are lived in societies that are undergoing conflict and of various, they must be integrated on the peacemaking table because they're human beings too. So we celebrated Security Council Resolution 1325, but as somebody who was on the sidelines during that time in a UN space, I can also tell you that it wasn't only the resolution. And Sonia's point about the women, it was Thursday. Women in Black. It inspired Women in Black on Thursdays, which we are part of now as Religions for Peace, joining the World Council of Churches, which was inspired by the work that you spoke to very much, Sonia. But we were pleased with an entire process that led to the Security Council resolution, because it was a process of enlightenment, for lack of a better word. I forgive the pun, I don't mean it, but it was almost a process of enlightenment of governments. And it was the process which brought together a growing civil society, international civil society, women-led movement that was very actively lobbying and supporting governments and the United Nations system in order to come out with what ended up being Security Council Resolution 1325. It was the process of it that most benefited and set in motion an example for the following Security Council resolution a couple of years ago on youth, peace and security. That, once your eyes are opened and the process of bringing voice to policy-making spaces globally, then you can start to bring more to the table. And I think, again, our willful ignorance sometimes and wanting to see things from a particular perspective, women are peace-loving people, and that's really what they do. When in fact, we know that women and men have a role to play and a responsibility and a series of wisdoms that is acquired through the roles that they play. I want to end by a story from Sierra Leone, which is Religions for Peace is incredibly proud of. For the last 25 years, this has been the best story in town. And I'm sorry to repeat it in case you've heard it before, but I really would like to say it because it brings out a very critical nuance. And the nuance is that when you bring religions together, men and women, truly, magic happens. God's grace and mercy happens when religions come together. When religions work in their own silos, separately, I'm not necessarily sure that that's where mercy resides. That's where politics definitely happens. We know that historically all over the years. But when religions come together, it is very difficult for them to come together in war. And I'll wager you one example where multiple religions fought wars together. Whereas, of course, we can cite a gazillion examples from where religions fought one another, as opposed to fought together on the same side. So here's an issue. The story goes that the Interreligious Council of Sierra Leone, one of the Religions for Peace, is 92 interreligious councils around the world. In the height of the conflict, the news comes in that there are 50 child soldiers who have been abducted by at that time of the guerrilla war, fighting the government troops. Many efforts, including from the UN system, other governments around the world, other civil society actors, try to get those 50 kids out from under the purview of the rebels, failed. The rebels were at the same time using the children as a bait for the government. They were saying, if you don't comply with our requirements, we are training them to become soldiers. I need to say that the children were anywhere between the ages of 10 to 15. So it was still a relatively tender space of time here. So a group of, when the religious men on the council tried their best to speak to these groups of different combatants, nothing happened. So the women decided, quite without telling their religious leaders, the male, that they got into a car and they got the driver to drive them to the rebel-held territories. And then they were confronted with a group of rebels holding guns at the car. I go, hey, what? And the women got out of the car and stepped out of the car and said, we are your mothers. Put those guns down and take us to your leader. They were taken to the leader and they leveraged their moral authority, not just as mothers, but as women of faith, Muslim and Christian. And they said they somehow managed to negotiate that these children were returned back to their families. There's a very similar recent example of a nun in Myanmar who gets on her knees in front of the police who are coming after the young demonstrators. The police are confronted with a nun on her knees and they tell her, our job is to go after the demonstrators, because some of the young demonstrators had gone and hidden in the convent or where the nuns were. And she said, you can take me, but leave them alone. There's been enough suffering now, please, there's enough. It's intense in Myanmar. And the image of her on her knees and the two policemen getting down on their knees too and bowing to her and ultimately leaving is a very, very powerful image. So I think we need to honor the fact that we may have issues with religion, plenty. We know that religions fight wars and cause wars, but we also know that there is a specific power that can be imbued that comes with faith. And that when women of faith stand together and when a woman speaks in the name of her faith for peace, it is a very difficult force indeed to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Azza. Wow, thank you for more powerful stories. First Sonia and now you, and also for both of you elucidating the kind of multifaceted roles that women position themselves in and participate in, both in peace and in war, so in the way those intersect. So James, we'll turn to you now and let's hear from you, and then we'll go back to question and answer.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me here. It's such an honor to join with such esteemed proponents of and activists and implementers of peace in a world that is frankly just deeply scarred with layers and layers of history of conflict. And so I'm so grateful to hear Sonia's firsthand experience of reshaping that history. And I always end up with Azza on different panels, and I find that a consistently humbling experience, which is a good thing. And Azza, I fully acknowledge, and I'm grateful to you too, to remind us not to be reductionist in our thinking about gender and roles in conflict and in peace building. I love the line where you said silos are not where mercy resides. And that is something I will take away and reflect on. But I was speaking to a supporter of ICRD the other day, and they said, thank you for the work that you're doing. And I have to say that's probably one of the more uncomfortable moments I have, because whenever I hear that, I think, we certainly try to do good work, but the real heroes of this work are those that are in the communities, standing right in the face of the tools of violence and calling for peace. People in their own communities, right? And we, of course, try to find and work with them and elevate their capacities. But these are really the heroes of the work. And there's little more humbling for me than to sit in community with folks who live in the midst of that kind of fear, that kind of risk, maybe the darkness of the human spirit that can erupt in those relationships and bring such pain. And instead they instinctively bring into that space a healing optimism. And while Aza is absolutely right that we should not just connect that to one particular gender or the other, and this is quite another long conversation we could have, and meaningful one. That in that sense lie the seeds of understanding and appreciation and frankly even love that's necessary to heal some of the wounds of history. So when I was reflecting on this panel, I was thinking, what is it that I will bring to this discussion? I thought maybe I can do a little bit of justice to some of these folks whose voices will never probably be heard in a space like this by recounting some of those stories. And much like Sonia, the anecdotal, I think, can be very, very powerful to get across some of the principles and ideas and methodologies and understandings that are more academic that we can take from these things. So there's so many different stories that we can tell, from a partner in Afghanistan who marched upon a Taliban stronghold to demand the release of the youth that had been taken from her town, similar to what Aza was just talking about. Those in Myanmar with whom our staff has worked that use cultural issues, cultural norms to pressure the military to stay out of their communities, such as hanging their traditional clothing on the wires above the streets, which is taboo for the men to pass under. The grandmothers in Latin America who have literally physically stood between gangs who are setting up to have knife fights with one another. But honestly, one particular story keeps coming to mind for me that really illustrates both the power and bravery of women of faith, but it also addresses your initial question to us about how is religion in conflict different than religious conflict. And again, this is another conversation we could have for hours and hours. Many panels could be populated with this, but I think of a woman that I knew, a nun in Colombia, in South America, named Maritze. And Maritze would join us with a bunch of other women of faith, peace builders, as we were working through strategies for reconciliation between former combatants and communities impacted by the conflict. Now, the vast majority of the women in that room were themselves either direct or indirect victims of violence. So it was quite a process to work through their own experience and arrive at a role where they could look for the healing of relationships despite their own experience with some of these folks that they were trying to work with, the former combatants. As they got together, they would always lay out the pictures of women peace builders who had been killed in this line of work. And that is a silent plague in the peace building field, that peace builders in general, but particularly women building peace who have certain vulnerabilities, are significant targets of violence. And so they would lay out the photographs of all of the women they had worked with who had been murdered, trying to build peace in their communities. And during the 3-day seminars, they would light candles and leave those pictures there as witnesses of the work that they were trying to do, and as a memorial to the people that had been lost. But Maritza in particular was just such a breath of fresh air. She had to be closing in on 80 years old, and she would dance and she would cry and she would laugh, and she would always end with, you know, the reading of a poem about the power of women in community. And I remember this one time where we ended the meeting, and she laughed again, and she said, now I have to go back to the community where the paramilitaries just knocked on my door for the third time and told me, if you keep doing this work, we will kill you. And so everyone kind of paused and said, Mertz, you know, are you okay? What do you need? This is concerning. And she laughed again. And she said, you know, it's when they don't tell you that you should be worried. And it just, the power of her bravery in the face of this kind of risk, just her conviction that what she was doing was necessary, meaningful, and the core of who she was. And, you know, she was a religious woman. One of the communications that we had, one of the sessions that we had, we brought women, former combatants, to Aza's point, from the paramilitary groups in together with women victims of violence. And, you know, we all learn as we go. And I would say this is probably one of my failings as a peace builder, was that I hastened that process a bit. And I learned very quickly that the ripeness that we learn about in terms of our process of communication and dialogue across difference wasn't quite there. And it was a quite a tense engagement and encounter. And so we broke. And the Christian women in the group, this is a mixed group between Indigenous women and Christian women. The Christian women left the room, and then they came back a few minutes later, and they were all draped in sheets. And of course, this took us by surprise. And then they sat, and in front of everybody else, they acted out a biblical pageant. And now, you know, this was their faith tradition, and this is what they went back to doctrinally to try to process the challenge that they were facing. And it was the pageant of the adulteress, for those of you who know the text. And the adulteress is brought through the streets and thrown in the dirt in front of Jesus, and he is commanded by the powers that be to pass judgment on her according to the law. And so they discussed this with respect to, you know, the government at the time was run by someone who was very much against the leftist guerrilla movement and wanted to effectively wipe them off the planet. And yet these women, as followers of the Christian tradition, said, what, you know, who are we? What are we meant to do if we believe in this faith doctrine, this idea, and the lessons and the stories and Jesus himself? How are we meant to emulate him when we are faced with someone who, much like in the story, has been brought in front of us unrepentant, and we feel compelled by our experience and by the people around us to pass judgment on them? And they processed this, and then they brought back what they learned about issues of forgiveness, but also issues of non-repetition and what it means to negotiate restitution with those who have committed offenses against others. It really helped them frame their ideas. And this is where religion is different, right? It wasn't just intellectual, it was spiritually intellectual. And they had a guide, and they had something to fall back on that for them was transcendent, that gave them the ability to work through their own suffering and struggles. And in all honesty, they brought all of that back into the room with Indigenous women who clearly, obviously, do not turn to the same texts. And they were able to inspire a conversation that identified shared values across these religious traditions in a way that really empowered their collective action as people of different faiths. And it's that kind of impact that faith can have. So yes, in the faith-based peace-building space, in so many cases, some of which I mentioned, women peace builders can accomplish what men might not. I mean, particularly in conservative religious spaces where women might not be traditionally included in formal leadership roles. Their position in the community, the reverence for their role in the family, for example, they're unique spaces for communication across difference, where they meet across difference naturally, organically, because of the way they operate in the community that men might not. Even their lack of a public profile allows for certain kinds of dialogue and certain statements and certain actions that men are more inhibited from engaging in, right? But there is a serious challenge, and this is what I would put out as a point of consideration, and maybe we can pick this up in the answer. But the challenge is back to this event that we had with the women in Colombia. After this, after many sessions, and they had really framed reconciliation in their own context, one of them came up to me afterwards and said, this is great, and now we really understand this. In fact, we understand it perhaps more profoundly than any of our religious colleagues that are men, but now we get to go back, in this case she was a nun, go back to the church and sweep out the pew. She said that we are structurally excluded in a way that doesn't allow us to practice some of the capacities that we have. And so, yes, ICRD is a conflict resolution organization. We look for the places of influence and power that people have to transform dynamics and dialogue where they are. But at the same time, while during conflict, sometimes institutional structures break down and we rely more on organic relationships in communities and organic persuasion, organic influence that women may be very potent in post-conflict spaces, oftentimes we revert back to those institutions that then exclude the very same people that we were engaging with to change people's minds and hearts in a way that allows for a transformation of the drivers of violence. And so the issue that's outstanding for us when it comes to engaging around gender issues and peace building is how do we make sure that we're looking for ways to continue to bridge that organic influence that women may have in spaces where they're not institutionally connected, that is so very powerful, I think, during conflict, with our reversion back to institutional structures that then exclude the very people we work with. I mean, I remember in Tunisia talking to young women activists who are very involved in what's been called the Arab Spring movement. And as soon as that was over and there were negotiations going on about what the government would look like and what society would look like, they found themselves on the sidelines. And so, the power and the potency of women peace builders is very important. But we are still faced with a consistent institutional exclusion of women, particularly in the faith-based space, that we as practitioners, we have to grapple with, and we have to think through how is it that we can help bridge the influence and power that is there, particularly when structures have broken down in a conflict circumstance, with sustaining those voices and insights and that influence into the post-conflict space where structures sort of revert to taking over the framing. Those very women in Colombia fought very, very hard to be involved in the dialogues in Havana, and it took them quite some time to do that, despite their work. They were initially excluded from the formal peace negotiations. They succeeded in getting included in that, but it was a big struggle. And so, I see when you ask this question about how do we engage women of faith in peace building, this is the one thing that I feel there is some institutional responsibility on behalf of those of us who engage in these spaces to work together to try to answer in order to sustain their impact into places where we revert again to institutional engagement that is exclusive. So I'll just leave it there, but thank you again so much for having this conversation and having us part of it.
Thank you, James, for that provocative conclusion. If you don't mind, I'm going to use the prerogative of the moderator discussant, or moderator to be discussant, or at least ask a question to all three of you that pivots off of where you just concluded, James. And you talked about the ongoing institutional exclusion of women. You said in faith-based spaces, in peace-building environments. And I wanted to ask all three of you, what are your experiences, or how would you respond to the question of whether or not political elites oftentimes reinforce the same patriarchy that we see in religious institutions when it comes to the exclusion of women from formal peace-building negotiations and processes, in the interest of not offending male-dominated religious institutions. So, don't want to offend those religious stakeholders that are invited to the peace building process and table. Therefore, don't include women from those faith communities. Is that a phenomenon that you've observed, or if it is, how can that be changed? And if it's not, I guess that's good. But why don't I start with you, James, and then I'll go back the opposite way from you to Azza to Sonia.
I would say yes, it is a consideration. I'll give one example from our own work. We worked closely with conservative faith actors in places where Salafi communities in North Africa were at risk, the youth in particular, of marginalization in their community, and that we saw as a contributing factor to potential recruitment to violent extremist organizations. So we were advocating for at least understanding the needs and interests of those Salafi communities so that they could be less marginalized, which is one of the factors that does contribute to radicalization, and understanding how to bring them in as advocates for preventing and mitigating extremism, because they do have the language and access and influence over at-risk populations. and we did encounter some pushback from folks about these other questions about their attitudes towards various things, but also certainly their gender attitudes within the structures of their institution. And the reason I bring that up and not directly address the political question is that I think we have to deal with a both and situation here, which is to say the ideal and the real are not in opposition. Sometimes we hear that folks are either realists or idealists, and I believe that the ideal is where we hope to get, and the real is how we plan to get there, marching through the contexts that we encounter. And so in some cases, it's very important to try to work with people in their positions of influence within the structures that exist. But that is not to say that our longer strategy should not include influencing people to transform any kind of exclusive structure. This is what this is all about, right? I mean, even peace building at its core is about not excluding the other. And I think what happens when you engage people where they are is you allow them to be more open to, as you understand who they are and where they are, more open to dialogue around some of these issues that may then transform their attitudes. And so if we go to some of these actors and tell them about the important influence that women of faith actors have, and these could be politicians or conservative faith leaders, if we've already engaged with them in a way that acknowledges their dignity as people and their right to practice their faith, then I find that they are more open to at least engaging in that dialogue. And if anything, sometimes the strategic elements of the discussion are more persuasive than just conversations about the theories of exclusion and inclusion. But if we don't dialogue with folks, we won't see that kind of transformation. And so I think whether they're politicians or conservative faith leaders, engagement is very important, in my opinion, because that's the only way to get people to begin to talk about shifting some of these things. But yes, it's very much an issue that we've encountered.
All right, thank you. Azza, how about you? And again, I'm asking you all to sort of unpack as well the kind of conventional wisdom that secular spaces may be more open to, be less patriarchal when it comes to women in peace building than our religious spaces. And I'm wondering if there's an unfortunate reinforcement effect at work here. And James suggests yes, but that there are ways beyond it.
So it's a brilliant question. It also echoes one of the questions in the chat box that you raised, Professor Pramodru. And I would say the following. First of all, learnings from multiple years of working on the intersection between religion, politics, and human rights indicates the following. One, that very often our assumptions that we have, whether how the secular spaces operate and how the religious spaces operate, very often our assumptions are and should be questionable. Because once you get involved in the midst of some of those spaces, you realize that stereotypes can be the guiding norm. So the notion that you just raised, that secular spaces can be a bit more accommodating of women peace builders, well, we wouldn't have needed a Security Council resolution to that effect if that were true. So clearly secular spaces are as culpable as religious spaces of exclusion of women's narratives, voices, experiences from any process in society, public process, especially in situations of conflict. If you recall, that's how I began my presentation. I said there's a story and a narrative here where in situations of conflict, women are invited to take part in the public space and immediately asked to return once the immediate conflict is over. That story hasn't changed, and that story is a story of political elitism. What happens in different contexts, however, is where the religious institutions are themselves embroiled in the political processes, which is, by the way, increasingly more frequent. It is now becoming the new normal. In fact, anywhere around the world, look at what happened with the Orthodox Church that broke up as a result of the Soviet, and you know this better than anybody else, as a result of the Russian occupation of the Ukraine. We suddenly have two churches, and a church that existed for centuries is ripped apart as a result of the political dynamics. Many such examples over history. In fact, the whole reason we have an Orthodox Church and a Catholic Church and a Protestant set of churches everywhere else has a lot to do with some of those religious politics that are also very secular in terms of the way that they are enacted. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the notion that the secular and the religious have very different standards. I do, however, maintain very powerfully that religious institutions are the ultimate bastions of patriarchy. The last fighting bastions of patriarchy are religious institutions. But we must be able to acknowledge that not all religions have centralized institutions. And as a result, how we see the world from a Christian-centric perspective is absolutely inaccurate when we then begin to look at Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist perspectives where there isn't a centralized institution, and therefore the politics and poetics of exclusion differ significantly from within these different religious traditions. James mentioned the Salafis, and I wonder where Salafis have been actually so recalcitrant against women when we know for a fact that many of these movements have, as I mentioned also in my presentation, are alive today and doing rather well in spite of severe political oppression and repression thanks to the women engaged in them. We mustn't forget that even with the Daesh context that we refer to still today as a collective international trauma, women were going to fight for Daesh and getting married to Daesh fighters as a prize. So the notion that the more fundamentalist or extremist a religious sect, the more it is against women is quite frankly rather false, because it's again not taking into account the myriad roles that women end up playing in those kinds of spaces, which also means that when we look at peace tables have traditionally been secularly inspired, secularly oriented, and secularly directed. There are very few religious peacemaking tables around the world today. When another lesson learned, when we try to intervene in a conflict that is not our own, we often end up coming against certain dynamics which may or may not have to do with local gender dynamics, which may or may not have to do with local politics, but definitely have a lot to do with internal relations, how different people are perceived. I have learned in the course of the last year alone in Religions for Peace that as a woman Secretary General of a movement, it doesn't necessarily automatically mean I will be listened to by well-established women in the movement. There is no automatism to this process. Indeed, I have to claim my legitimacy and authority. And in a context of conflict, if I was to go today to a situation of conflict that is not my own, but I'm coming from New York, the perception of me will differ significantly than when I was in that same country many years ago as a citizen of it. How I am seen today will differ from the way that I'm same country, same people, but today I come from New York. 25 years ago, I was there in my own country. That perception of me differs, and per definition, the ways in which my arguments are being made will be taken accordingly. I think it's very, very easy for us to assume, Elizabeth, that there's this magical formula and it's only the religious folks who are opposed to it. No, if you look at the context of the Catholic Church and you realize that there are women, veterans of those spaces for the longest possible times. Yes, they are not able to become a pope. Yes, many of them are not able to become ordained, but they are veterans of the Catholic Church and its institutional establishment and civic spaces and political and peace-building spaces too. I think James was the one who mentioned some contexts in Colombia. There's also Peru. There are many others. So yeah, it's not as clear-cut as secular and political, but I can tell you, elites everywhere fight for their own power and their own dominance. But those elites include women too.
Okay, wow. All right. That was a powerful indictment of elites, but also the the complicity and the participation of multiple genders. So it's not only about patriarchy, it's about power. Sonia, I turn it over to you.
Well, Elizabeth, your question, in fact, inspired me to think of a very different kind of example. In the beginning of 90s, end of 80s, beginning of 90s, if there was a movement in Eastern Europe that we all looked up with great admiration, it was Solidarity movement, Solidarność. And of course, Lech Walesa as the legend of that movement. Well, very few people remember still that it was Anna Valentovic who started the Gdańsk uprising. Anna Valentovic, who, by the way, and again, almost not mentioned, died in that plane crash when one of the brother Kaczynskis crashed over Smolensk, and she was in that group of people. The Solidarność movement was probably one of the most patriarchal movements of all those emancipatory movements in Eastern Europe that one could think about. Interestingly enough, when the putsch, Jaruzelski's putsch happened in 92, and most of the leaders were arrested, and there are books devoted to this whole story, the women were stayed out of prisons, and they were those who in fact managed to keep most of them, their wives, their sisters, even mothers. They kept the flame while they were in prison. The moment, as I said, when they got out of prison, this was forgotten, of course. I happen to know some of those women, for example, Małgorzata Tarasiewicz, who was one of the leading women voices within the Solidarność movement, insisting also on the right of women to be trade union leaders. She was pushed out. She's today one of the leaders of the network of East-West women. Elizabeth, you remember, one of the founders was my very, very dear friend, Ensnitov, who died in August 2019. The network was in fact established in the US and then was transferred to Poland. And Małgorzata is one of the leaders of the network of East-West women in Poland, but never ever managed to really remain in the Solidarność movement as a woman and as an activist. So they were obviously very patriarchal, not only because they were, Walesa and many of them were very, very devoted Catholics, because there were others who were not. But there they had a very common language. Now, I'm jumping 25 years ahead. The latest movements in Poland of women who took the streets and proved that they are the real, so to say, strength of the opposition movement to these new autocrats, new autocratic, in fact, government of present Poland. And interestingly enough, I have a feeling the first time they managed to kind of catch the entire society with them and as of course I'm watching it from far away, but it seems to me that finally that patriarchal kind of cage that was managing to survive all those different changes and ruptures finally is really falling apart in or at least be very seriously questioned in this new movement for emancipation in the same country. So I find that Polish story really very, very exciting when thinking about the question you posed to us.
Okay, thank you. This is great. I'm going to follow upward, and I'll start with Aza and Sonia and then go to James. There was a question in the chat about whether or not you see Resolution 1325 as lacking. If it's lacking, where and how to fix it. And I think, Aza, you said before, if everything were fine, if there were no patriarchy, whether within religious or secular spaces, there wouldn't have been a need for Res 1325. But now we have it. So to both of you, I'll start with Sonia, then go to Aza, then to James. What do you think about the resolution? Has it made a difference? What are its deficits? How can we remedy those?
Well, I must say the resolution meant a lot for not only me personally, but my organization. The Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence managed to, in fact, in cooperation with women from various walks of the society, from ministries of defense to civil society activists, in fact, push through process of adoption, not only adoption of 1325 in Serbia, but Serbia, quite a patriarchal country, was among the first dozen who officially adopted the resolution and made a national action plan. And in October 2010, in fact, we had it accepted as a state policy. Where is the deficiency? Almost completely forgotten 11 years later. And I think that part of the Aza is of course much more competent to talk about this, but my feeling is that one of the problems with the resolution was that so many documents and so many discussions about documents took place in several fora all over the world, and not enough activism, not enough endorsement of real processes and involvement in those real processes have been happening. I remember when some of my friends from New York said, we don't go anymore to those meetings because they are again talking about the new document. It seems to me that somehow, again, I dare to say, those international organization elites and very often a technocratic, bureaucratic approach, unfortunately also within the women movement, somehow became so dominant that the real forces that needed a new approach to the role of women to be practiced, a new approach in peace building, a new approach in understanding how different kinds of issues within a society, not necessarily a war, not necessarily a bloody conflict, but also, for example, in something we see, we live here in Serbia, still a lot of gender-based violence, still dozens of women being killed every year in this gender-based violence in a small country, in a European country, simply are not anymore in the picture. So I think this is one of the problems of otherwise a very, very important, not only resolution, but I would say at one point I had a feeling that it in itself, it is empowering a movement. I don't feel it anymore.
Yes.
All right, thank you. That's encouraging. I mean, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, Aza.
I completely concur with Sonia. Sonia's analysis is 1,001% correct. I would say two things. First of all, indeed, the as I think I mentioned in my conversation, I think that the process of reaching 1325, Security Council Resolution 13, that process in and of itself was incredibly valuable. And the challenge, of course, is as with any resolution from the United Nations International Convention. Who remembers the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women? Who talks about it today beyond the CEDAW committee in certain places? We've forgotten so much of what was so hard fought for and so revolutionary when it came about. To be honest, any international resolution, convention, treaty is as good as what we are able to make of it as citizens. Anything. And today we're decrying a fact where human rights in general, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself is rarely mentioned in activist circles, and where indeed in many countries around the world, even before COVID pandemic struck, we were talking about and complaining and alerting to a shrinking civil society space. What does a shrinking civil society space mean? It means that human rights are seriously endangered. That's what a shrinking civil society space means. Because a shrinking civil society space is a very powerful presence of an omnipotent, oppressive state or regime structure. And when that happens, that is rarely ever in defense of human rights, where usually oppression of a state regime comes at the expense of human rights. So if we were already complaining about a shrinking civil society space, read a very seriously decompressed space for human rights, then obviously with the pandemic, we are now talking about authoritarian regimes more empowered than before the pandemic, because of course now they're supposed to be saving people's lives, isn't it? So now the measures of oppression have catapulted, but in the name of saving spaces. So effectively, what was a shrinking civil society space before is now an endangered species civil society, which means that human rights in general are seriously endangered almost everywhere in the world. So if that is the case, then would we hold Security Council Resolution 1325 as a loner? No. Security Council Resolution 1325, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, CEDAW, and almost all those brilliant, amazing conventions that are hard fought for are all being threatened by the current geopolitics that we are living through. And the pandemic has not helped. It has added to the stringency of measures that are being imposed by oppressive regimes and structures, which ultimately hurts the entire human rights space and narrative, in fact. So if that is the case, then I would say I agree with what Sonia said 1,000%, but it's not simply the Security Council 1325. And this brings me to the other deficiency of 1325. In the drafting of the 1325, we were talking about, you asked that question about elites, Elizabeth, spot on as usual. Elites drafted 1325. Elite civil society organizations were able to be part of the process of moving it forward, calling for it, and achieving that revolution of the, quite frankly, the obvious. And no, hello, women, they should be there. We need to actively work to make sure that they're there, right? It's very obvious, but then genius at the same time. So, but it was a group of elite women. It wasn't a mass mobilization of women's movements. It was the mobilization of the women already in the civil society space who had already learned and were learning how to implement, how to influence decision makers in different spaces. And that does not apply to the majority of women. It applies, quite frankly, to a relatively elite group of women in most civic society spaces around the world. So yes, after a while, as we've seen with the questioning of political institutions everywhere, there is also a questioning of the elite's capacity to rule as they were. That means that all those wonderful things that some of the elites fought hard for, and let's face it, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was also an elite initiative, but they did good things. The elites are not just all universally bad people. They achieved globally what we today call the United Nations system, the multilateral system. So we actually owe elite activism quite a bit too. And then to see that being harmed, in a sense, being less attributable in present normal of the geopolitics of might makes right, we can see that much of what has been achieved for the good of all is also harmed by the fact that our entire geopolitical dynamics are harmed. But at no point in 1325, brought about by the elites and CEDAW before it, at no point did it occur to the drafters that religion could be an influence for good. In fact, it wasn't mentioned at all. And if it was mentioned as a force for problems. Right? So we actually have a document that did not involve and engage a great number of people of faith in the name of their faith, as we have with almost all. And CEDAW is particularly culpable. CEDAW does mention religion ever so specifically, but as a source of harm, which of course we all know it is. It can be. So CEDAW specifically notes that the religious and cultural are a pushback, are a pullback to the rights in question. Security Council 1325 doesn't really pay much attention to religion, and if it does, it's in passing as yes, we're not going to waste time on that. We've got to insist on the legitimacy of the rights of all, regardless of whatever. So effectively, we didn't mobilize women of faith in that space that was to celebrate and to realize and to try to implement and to use 1325 to advocate for women, peace, and security. Women of faith were not part of that process. And I can say that because in our Women of Faith movement and Religions for Peace, it's the largest women of faith movement globally. 1325 is known, but it is known not because it involved and is seen to be owned by women of faith. It is known because, of course, it's about women, and anything to do with women is the business of women. But it has completely, and this is a case with the entire women's movement globally, that we actually have a bifurcated women's movement globally. We have a secular women's movement that is vibrant and massive and having its own issues for many, many years. And then we have the women of faith women's movement, which is pretty hard to come together and to pull together. But that's why Religions for Peace hosted that assembly, Elizabeth, in which you were one of the prominent speakers in November of last year, where it was about women, faith, and diplomacy. And where the whole conversation was about where does faith, where do religious institutions, religious actors, and religious leaders place themselves on the spectrum of the continuum and the intersectionality between women, faith, and diplomacy? And what did we learn? Many things, one of which is that you need to acknowledge the value of the religious institution precisely as you hold it to account for being harmful. You must also acknowledge where women come with their faith to the table, where they are presidents and prime ministers of secular nations, but they are very much moved by their faith. And you saw the speech from Angela Merkel in the opening of that assembly to say, I am a person of faith, and I see and I understand fully how it can be a force for good as it is a force for problems. But I'm glad that you are now beginning to unpack how religions can be a force for good in all women and men's lives. And I think that awareness has been missing for some time. And because it has been missing, we've missed out again on the inclusion of a significant segment of the world's population in the realization and the claiming of the rights and the opportunities given by these global resolutions.
Okay, I think we're almost near closing time, but I wanted, before turning it over to Juliana and Shireen, I just wanted to follow up on James, ask you if you would have any follow-up comments on Sonia and Aza's observations about 1325, and specifically linked to a question in the chat, which was, do women remove themselves from the peacemaking or peace-building process precisely because of either patriarchy in secular or religious institutions, or because they see that there's no meaningful role for them if they're not part of elite structures or elite groups? So closing thought on that. I know it's a lot of questions melded into one, but it draws from both of their comments, I think.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. If I were wiser than I am, I'm getting some feedback too. I'm not sure. Oh, thank you. I would probably let Aza's passion carry the end of the conversation. But just to add one thing, I mean, frankly, and I agree with everything that was said before me, but it is an important thing that many high-profile persons and organizations and nations stepped forward and stated that this was important. But we can all list a litany of situations abroad and at home where what is written down in a declaration or in law is not put into practice in communities. And so the thing that I guess I would suggest and hope for is that we continue to try to help as we can people both in and out of these elite structures to understand how to implement this in reality on the ground, right? And as we mentioned before, and I kind of put it in the chat box, you know, power, people who come to power by certain mechanisms find it very hard to then undo those mechanisms willingly themselves. It's very rare. And so some of these structures that continue to reinforce the division between the access to power for men and women are hard to break down when you have men in power. These are cycles, and it doesn't matter if it's a gender issue, it doesn't matter if it's a political issue. It's hard for those in power to willingly undo the mechanisms that brought them there. So yes, there needs to be work, there needs to be help. Now, do women willingly pull themselves out of opportunities to be involved in the conversation because they see that their influence is not as strong as it could or should be? I've never witnessed that. I have seen overwhelmingly people throwing themselves against the wall, trying as they might because of their passion and their conviction to be heard. And honestly, I feel like our role as organizations from the outside, oftentimes coming in to support these communities, is to maybe try to give those people, whether it's women or indigenous people or youth, whomever might be excluded from power structures, give them a hand up over the wall if possible, and see if we can little by little restructure the infrastructure that keeps them out.
All right, thank you to all three of you. First of all, to Sonia Licht for being with us till 1 o'clock in the morning in Belgrade, for Dr. Aza Karam for being with us as she transfers between office and automobile, and for James Patton for being with us, just for being with us. And I turn it over now to the two co-organizers, Juliana Rodolph and Shireen Shah.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for moderating what has been such a fantastic panel. We're lucky to have you as our RLD leader and as the moderator tonight.
And thank you to all the panelists. We really appreciate you being here tonight.
We're also so glad that so many joined from both inside and outside of the Fletcher community and put some great questions in the chat. Your support really made this panel and others of this spring possible, and your support of RLD in general is greatly appreciated.
And lastly, we wanted to thank both of our co-sponsors, the Conference on Gender International Affairs, as well as LEADS for all their support.
And one final plug, Professor Prodromou mentioned this at the start, but a final plug for our final panel of the semester, Religion and Community, Growing Resilience Through Interfaith Peacebuilding, which will be on April 1st. So the registration link is on the RLD website and we will be sending it out. And we look forward to seeing you all there.
Yep, and thanks again, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the night.
Thank you.